cane tapped the wet sidewalk outside a small brick office. A thin hand wrapped tighter around the wooden handle. An old hound limped sideways at the woman's hip. The hound's right hip dragged. The woman's right hip dragged too. They went up the 3 concrete steps, one slow step at a time. The hound waited on each step until the woman caught her breath. The woman waited on each step until the hound caught his. At the top, the brass door handle was higher than her elbow. She turned it. The door pushed open into a small waiting room that smelled of pencil shavings and old carpet. A young receptionist looked up. She set down her pen. She did not speak. The woman walked in. The hound walked in beside her. They sat down on the bench. Whose small brick office was this? Stay with me on this one. Her name was Doris Hatcher. She was 69 years old, and she had walked 3 miles into town this morning on a bad hip and a wooden cane to ask the young lawyer in the brick office on Main Street for 1 more month in her own home before the bank's eviction. Notice came due on the 1st of the next month. She had not driven into town because the pickup truck had been sold to pay the funeral costs in March, and she had not asked any of her neighbors for a ride because she had not spoken to most of her neighbors since the funeral, and she had not called a taxi because she had counted the $7.40 left in the bread tin on the kitchen counter, and she had decided the $7.40 was for the lawyer's filing fee and not for the taxi. She had set out at 6 in the morning with her old arthritic hound Tucker on a leather lead at her hip, and her thin wool coat buttoned to her throat against the spring chill. Tucker was 11 years old. He had been her late husband Frank's hound first, brought home from the county shelter 11 winters ago as a half-grown stray with a bad right hip and a wary eye and a thin scar across his nose from a fight he had been the loser of. Frank had named him Tucker because Tucker had tucked himself into the smallest corner of the kitchen the first night and not come out until Frank had laid down on the kitchen floor beside him with a slice of cold ham. Frank had loved the hound for 10 years. Frank had died in February of a heart he had not told her was failing, sitting in his armchair in the front room with the Sunday paper open on his lap, and Tucker had laid across his cold feet for 2 hours before Doris had come downstairs in her robe and understood what she was looking at. Tucker had stayed with her every day of the 7 weeks since. He had walked beside her at the funeral. He had walked beside her to the bank manager's office on the day she had learned that Frank had not, in fact, paid off the mortgage as he had told her he had for 10 years, that the small farmhouse on the ridge above the creek was still owed $11,000 in principal and a back interest debt of $2,400, and that the bank intended to send the eviction notice unless Doris could produce the full balance by the 1st of next month. The bank manager had not been unkind. He had been a young man in a stiff blue tie who had said the word, regrettably, 3 times in the same sentence. Doris had walked out of the bank with Tucker at her hip and stood on the sidewalk in March and looked at the front of the small Main Street office of the young attorney, whose name she had read in the local paper under the small notice that read new practice now open. She had not gone in that day. She had gone in today, 6 weeks later, with the eviction notice in her thin hand and the $7.40 from the bread tin folded into the inside pocket of her wool coat and Tucker at her hip on the leather lead. She had walked the 3 miles from the ridge above the creek to Main Street in the cold spring sun in 2.5 hours, stopping every quarter-mile to let her hip rest and to let Tucker rest his, and they had arrived at the brick office at 8:30 with the wet sidewalk slowly drying around them and a pale gold light beginning to climb up the brick. She had stood at the curb a full minute before she had taken the 3 concrete steps to the door. Tucker had taken the steps beside her, slowly, one at a time, his right hip dragging on each one. She had not let go of the cane. She had not let go of the lead. She had gone in. The young receptionist behind the small wooden desk in the waiting room did not speak for a long second after Doris and Tucker sat down on the bench. She was a girl of perhaps 22 with a careful office blouse and a pencil tucked behind one ear. She had not seen many old women with old hounds come into the office in the 6 months she had worked there. She finally said, quietly, that the attorney would be with her in a moment. She picked up a small intercom phone and pressed a button and spoke into it. She listened. She nodded. She set the phone down. She told Doris that the attorney would see her now. She offered to walk her down the hall. Doris said she could walk. She stood up off the bench slowly on the cane, and Tucker stood up beside her on his stiff hip, and the two of them walked down the carpeted hall to a door marked Mr. Caldwell in small letters on a brass plate. The door was open. The young attorney inside was perhaps 32 years old. He wore a white shirt and a dark tie, and a pair of round glasses that had slid down his nose. He stood up as soon as he saw the old woman in the doorway and the old hound at her hip. He walked around the small wooden desk and pulled out the chair on her side and said, "Please sit down." Doris sat. She lowered herself slowly onto the wooden chair and laid the cane across her knees. Tucker lay down at her feet without being asked. The attorney did not sit back down at the desk right away. He walked over to a small side cabinet and brought back a clay water bowl from the bottom shelf and filled it from a glass pitcher and set it down on the carpet in front of Tucker. Tucker lifted his gray head and looked up at the young attorney for a long second, and then lowered his nose and drank. The attorney went back around the desk and sat down. He folded his hands on the leather blotter. He looked at Doris. He asked quietly what she had come to see him about. Doris pulled the folded eviction notice out of the inside pocket of her wool coat and set it on the leather blotter between them. She did not say anything. The attorney unfolded the notice with both hands and read it through, twice, slowly. He set it back down. He looked up. He asked her what she would like him to do. Doris told him. She said she would like him to write a letter to the bank manager and ask for one more month before the eviction date, because she needed the time to begin packing and to find a small rental room in town, and because she did not have the $11,000 and the $2,400 in back interest, and because she did not have anywhere else to go. She said it once, plainly, without crying, the way she had practiced saying it on the long walk down the ridge that morning. She said she could pay him $7.40 for the letter, and she pulled the small folded bills and the small handful of coins out of the inside pocket and laid them on top of the eviction notice on the leather blotter. The young attorney looked at the bills and the coins. He looked at the hound at her feet, drinking from the clay bowl. He looked at her face. He did not pick up the money. He said quietly that he would write the letter, and that he would not charge her for the letter, and that she could put the money back in her coat. She did not put it back. She said she would not take a letter she had not paid for. He sat back in his chair and looked at her for a long second. He nodded. He said, "All right." He picked up the $7.40 and laid it carefully in a small wooden tray on the corner of the desk. He told her the letter would be in the mail before noon. He told her she should expect an answer by the end of the week. He asked her if there was anything else she needed his help with today. Doris was about to say no when the attorney's eye fell on a name written across the top of the eviction notice in the bank's careful block lettering. The name was the name of her late husband, Frank. The attorney's eye stayed on the name for a long second. He picked up the notice and read the name twice. He looked up. He asked her quietly if her husband's full name had been Franklin J. Hatcher. Doris said yes. The attorney sat very still for a moment. Then he stood up. He walked to a small file cabinet behind the desk. He opened the bottom drawer. He sorted through a row of brown manila envelopes. He pulled one out. The manila envelope was sealed with a small dab of red wax. The wax had hardened to a dull dark brown over the years. The envelope was labeled in pencil on the front, "Hold for Doris Hatcher upon presentation of an unfavorable communication from First Vermont Bank." The attorney brought the envelope back to the desk. He set it down between them. He sat back down in his chair. He said his father had been the attorney in this brick office before him, and his father had passed the practice down to him last year on his retirement, and that he, the younger Caldwell, had inherited his father's old escrow files along with the desk and the file cabinet. He said his father had taken this envelope into the office 11 years ago from a man named Franklin J. Hatcher with instructions to hold the envelope in escrow until the day, A certain kind of letter came to the man's widow from the bank. He said the file note in his father's hand said the envelope had not been opened since the day it was sealed. He said his father had written on the inside of the file folder the single sentence, "Open in front of her only." Doris sat very still in the wooden chair across from him for a long second. Tucker lifted his gray head from the clay bowl on the carpet and pressed his nose against her ankle. The young attorney slid the envelope across the leather blotter so it lay on the wood directly in front of her. He set a small letter opener beside it. He did not move. Doris did not move either. She finally picked up the letter opener and slid it under the dark red wax seal. The wax cracked. She lifted the envelope flap. She slid out what was inside. There were 3 pieces of paper inside the envelope. The first was a long official document with a county seal in the upper corner, the kind of seal she had seen on the wall at the county courthouse the year Frank had once paid the tax bill on the small farmhouse in person. The document had 2 columns of careful typewritten text and a line for a signature at the bottom. The signature at the bottom was Frank's. The date on the signature was 11 years ago. The document was a deed. It was the deed to the 100-acre parcel of unworked land that sat directly to the north of their own small property along the creek, the same parcel that the old farmer Wendell Mott had owned and had let the trees grow over after his back gave out in his 60s, the same parcel that had been sitting quietly for 2 decades on the south side of the Long Ridge. The deed transferred full ownership of the parcel from Wendell Mott to Doris Hatcher in fee simple, free and clear, with a notation in the lower corner that the purchase price of $22,000 had been paid in full on the date of signature. The second piece of paper was a small folded handwritten letter on Frank's old yellow notepad paper. The third piece of paper was a small typewritten statement from the local title office confirming that the deed had been recorded in the county registry 11 years ago and that no other claim existed against the parcel. Doris unfolded the small handwritten letter first. She read it twice. The letter said, in Frank's careful small handwriting, that he had been saving every spare dollar from the egg money and the small construction jobs since the 2nd year of their marriage, and that the savings had finally come to enough in the year Tucker came home from the shelter that he had been able to buy Wendell Mott's old parcel without telling her, and that he had bought the parcel because he had wanted her to have a piece of land in her own name that no bank could ever touch if the small farmhouse ever fell into trouble, and that he had been planning to tell her on her 60th birthday, and that he had lost his nerve and waited, and that he had then lost his nerve again on her 65th, and that he had finally written the escrow instructions and sealed the envelope and walked it down to the attorney's office on the day of her 68th birthday. 6 months before he had died in the armchair in the front room with the Sunday paper open on his lap. He apologized in the letter for not telling her sooner. He said the parcel was hers, free and clear, and the small farmhouse on the south side of the ridge could be sold to pay off the bank without taking anything from her, because she would still own the 100 acres directly to the north, and because the 100 acres had a small spring on it and a level place near the spring that was suitable for building a small new house, and because she could sell off the timber along the east edge in a single sale for enough money to build a small new cabin near the spring, with the help of any of the local boys who still owed him favors. He said he had been keeping a quiet widow fund for her the whole marriage, in case the day came when she needed it without him there to help, and that the day had apparently come, and that he was sorry he was not standing there in the office with her, and that he loved her, and that he wanted her to know she was not losing anything she could not replace. He signed the letter at the bottom, Frank. Doris held the letter in her thin hand. She did not move for a long second. Tucker pressed his head against her knee. She read the letter a 3rd time. She finally folded the letter carefully and set it on the leather blotter beside the deed. She looked up at the young attorney across the desk. She did not speak for a long second. The young attorney did not speak either. He waited. Doris finally said one sentence. She said her husband had been keeping a secret from her for 11 years, and the secret was 100 acres. The young attorney smiled slowly, the way a young attorney smiles when something quiet and good has happened in his office. He nodded. He told her that the deed was in order, that the recording was clean, that no other claim could be made against the parcel, and that she was, as of this moment, the sole legal owner of 100 acres of land on the south side of the long ridge above the creek, debt-free, mortgage-free, and fully able to use the parcel in any way she wished. He said he would be glad to assist her with the timber sale, the rezoning paperwork, and the small construction permits, and that he would charge her his usual hourly rate, which she did not need to pay until after the timber sale closed. He said her $7.40 was already paid for the letter to the bank, and that he had not forgotten that. He said the letter to the bank was no longer needed. He said he would, instead, write a letter to the bank manager closing the matter, with payment in full of the $11,000 and the $2,400 enclosed from the proceeds of the timber sale within 30 days. He told her she would not need to leave the small farmhouse. He told her she could choose, instead, to live in the small farmhouse on her existing parcel for the rest of her life, and to leave the new 100 acres to the woods, or to build a small new cabin on the new parcel as Frank had described, or to do whatever else she chose. He said the choice was hers. He said it once and quietly. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button. Doris did not answer for a long moment. She set her thin hand on Tucker's gray head at her knee. He pressed back. She finally said quietly that she would think about it. The young attorney nodded. He stood up. He came around the desk. He bent down and offered her his hand, palm up, the way a young attorney with good manners offers a hand to a 70-year-old client who has come into his office on a wooden cane with her late husband's hound. Doris set her thin hand inside his palm. He helped her to her feet. He walked her and Tucker slowly back down the carpeted hall to the front waiting room. He held the door open for her at the top of the 3 concrete steps. He told her he would drive her back home in his own car if she would let him, and that he would not charge her for the drive. Doris said yes. She did not have the strength to walk 3 miles back up the ridge today. The young attorney walked them both around the side of the brick office to a small blue sedan parked at the curb. He helped Doris into the passenger seat. He laid the cane on the back floor. He lifted Tucker onto the back seat, gently, with both arms under the old hound's stiff hips. He closed the doors. He drove them home up the long county road in the pale gold morning light with Doris in the front seat, with the small folded letter from Frank in her thin hand, and Tucker on the back seat with his gray nose pressed against the window. He turned onto the gravel driveway of the small farmhouse on the south side of the ridge at 10:30. He stopped the sedan at the top of the driveway. He got out and walked around to the passenger side and helped Doris down out of the seat with the cane in her hand. He lifted Tucker out of the back seat. He carried the old hound up the 3 porch steps and set him down on the wooden boards at the front door. He carried Doris's small handbag and the $7.40 in coins, which he had returned to her at the door of the office along with a receipt, up the steps and set them on the porch table. He told her he would call her at the end of the week with the date of the timber sale. He told her she did not need to do anything until then. He told her the small farmhouse and the 100 acres were both fully hers, and that the bank would have nothing further to say to her. He said good morning. He drove back down the gravel driveway. Doris stood on the porch with her thin hand on the rail and watched the small blue sedan turn back onto the county road and disappear past the pines. She did not move for a long second. She finally turned and walked through the open front door. Tucker followed her. She sat down at the kitchen table with a small folded letter from Frank in her thin hand. She read it a 4th time. She read it a 5th time. She did not cry. She had not cried in 3 months. She set the letter on the kitchen table. She walked to the small bread tin on the kitchen counter. She lifted the lid. She put the $7.40 back inside. She closed the lid. She turned. She walked back to the kitchen table and sat down. Tucker lay down at her feet. The sun came in through the kitchen window in long warm bands across the table and the floor and the old hound's gray flank. Doris sat at the table for a long time. By noon she had walked slowly on the cane, out the back kitchen door, and down the small back path to the line of pines at the north edge of her property. She had stood at the line of pines and looked north, across the line, into the 100 acres of trees that now belonged to her. The 100 acres climbed gently up the slope of the ridge to a low rise where a small spring trickled out of a mossy stone. She had walked there once with Frank, on a Sunday afternoon 30 years ago, before either of them had any idea what either of their bodies would look like at 69. She had not been back. She walked the small path along the edge of the line of pines, now with her cane in one thin hand, and Tucker limping at her hip on his stiff right side. They went slowly. The wind moved through the pines. The spring sun came down through the new green and lit the long needles on the ground in front of her boots. She stopped at the line. She put her thin hand on the trunk of the last pine on the south side of the line. She looked north into her 100 acres. Tucker pressed against her knee. She stood there a long time. She finally walked back to the farmhouse. By the time she reached the back kitchen door, a neighbor had walked up the gravel driveway from the county road. The neighbor was a thin man named Vaughn, who lived at the next farm down the ridge. Vaughn had been the one who had called the county about Frank's unpaid back taxes on the truck 3 winters ago, and the county had revoked the registration and made Frank pay a fine he could not afford, and Frank had never forgiven Vaughn. Doris had not spoken to Vaughn in 3 winters. He was standing now at the bottom of the porch steps in his work boots and his red plaid coat with his cap in his hands. He had heard somehow that an attorney's car had been seen turning into her driveway that morning, and the small town being what it was, he had walked up the ridge to see for himself whether the eviction had come. Doris stood at the top of the porch steps with her cane in her thin hand and Tucker at her hip. She looked down at Vaughn at the bottom of the steps. He did not meet her eye at first. He finally lifted his face. He had the careful look on him of a thin neighbor who has come to make sure a widow is not being put out of her house on his account, and who is, in his own quiet way, sorry. Doris held his eye for a long second. She thought about what she had been planning to say to Vaughn for 3 winters. She did not say it. She said instead his first name. She said, "Good morning, Vaughn." She said it the way she had said good morning to him every morning for the 20 years before the back tax bill. Vaughn closed his eyes for one breath. He opened them. He nodded once. He said good morning back. He said his wife had baked a loaf of bread that morning, and he had brought it up the ridge, and he had left it on the porch table because he had not been sure she would be home, and he had not wanted her to come back to an empty porch. He said he was sorry about Frank. He said he was sorry about the truck. He said he was sorry he had not come up the ridge in 3 winters. Doris held the cane in her thin hand. Tucker pressed against her knee. She finally said quietly that she was sorry too. She said she was not losing the farmhouse. She said the bank was being paid. She said the 100 acres to the north now belonged to her. She said she would not be needing the small rental room in town. She said she would be needing, instead, a few of the local boys, sometime in the late summer, to help her build a small new cabin near the spring on the new parcel. She said she would be paying. She said she hoped Vaughn would tell the boys. Vaughn looked up at her for a long second. He smiled slowly. He nodded. He said he would tell them. He said he would, himself, come up the ridge any day she needed him. He picked up his cap and turned and walked back down the gravel driveway, slowly in his work boots, with his thin shoulders square. Doris stood on the porch with Tucker at her hip and watched him go. She picked up the small loaf of bread from the porch table. She carried it inside. She sat down at the kitchen table and laid the bread beside the small folded letter from Frank. She broke off a small piece and gave it to Tucker. He ate it slowly with his old yellow teeth. The sun moved across the kitchen floor in long, warm bands. Doris sat at the table for a long time, in the small farmhouse Frank had quietly bought 100 acres of land to protect, with the old hound he had brought home from the shelter at her feet, and she did not cry, and she did not need to. By the end of that summer, the timber sale on the east edge of the new parcel had closed for $28,000, and the bank had been paid in full, and the small farmhouse on the south side of the ridge stood debt-free in her name for the first time in 40 years. By the end of the next summer, a small new cedar cabin stood near the spring on the new parcel, built by 4 of Vaughn's neighbor boys and one of Vaughn's own grandsons, paid in cash at the going rate, with a small front porch facing south and a single chimney pipe rising out of the cedar shake roof. Doris did not move into the new cabin. She kept the small farmhouse on the south side of the ridge as her own. She gave the new cabin to Vaughn's grandson Eli, who had just married, and who had been the boy who had carved the cedar lintel above the new cabin's front door, and who had told Doris, the day the lintel went up, that he had not had a place to bring a new wife home to before. Doris told Eli the cabin was his on one condition, that Tucker would always have a place by his hearth when the weather got cold, and the long walk between the 2 houses got too far for the old hound's stiff hip. Eli said yes. Tucker slept by the cabin's hearth every winter night of the 4 winters he had left. And Frank's widow fund, the 100 acres on the north side of the ridge, held 2 houses and 2 families and 2 old hearths, and the south side of the ridge held the small farmhouse where a thin widow on a wooden cane lived for the rest of her quiet, careful, repaid life.